Hey, good evening, everybody. At least here it's evening. It's probably morning, afternoon, or night where you are. Welcome to the live stream today. Looking very much forward to chatting with you tonight. I saw you posted a bunch of questions as a reply to my community post, so thank you for that. I'm going to try and answer as many of them as possible. Before we start, though, I have something new. I released that last week. It's actually a free workshop. Maybe you saw it already in the video of last Friday. What I noticed is that also after looking a bit at the comments that you posted, is that it's really hard to start refactoring code before you understand what the problems are. And for me, that was something I really had to train myself on learning that. And in general, that's actually true, that before you can start solving something, you really need to think about what the problem actually is. Because if you don't do that, then you run the chance that you're actually solving the wrong problem, which is, of course, not what you want. So I recorded a workshop, a code diagnosis workshop, that kind of took the things that I generally do when I look at code, when I do code reviews, and package that up and try to summarize a bit of how I approach reviewing code and what the important things are to look at. So that's the diagnosis workshop. You can go to the link I added here at the bottom to check it out. It's free. Right. So last time during the live stream, I was kind of celebrating my 100K milestone, which was of course really cool. And so I thought, you know what, I should do this live stream thing a bit more often. It's a lot of fun, and I also feel like it's nice to be able to chat with you live instead of delayed after recording and editing everything. So this is like the real raw Arjan, which is also interesting. So I'm going to do this every month from now on, just once a month. So if you have any questions for me, I will again post like a community post a couple of days before. So you can just post your questions there, and then I'll try to answer them, as many as I can. All right. If you have questions now, you can post them in the chat, but I'm also going to go through the questions that I got in the community post. So let me start by that. Just going to scroll down a bit. All right, so the first question that I want to talk about is a question from Baris. Hello, Arjan. Greetings from Turkey. I'm wondering, how do you handle mission-critical systems? How is logging and exception handling? How does it work? Have you ever worked with any mission-critical app like banking systems, to give some examples? So, yeah, banking systems are, of course, extremely mission-critical. I haven't worked in finance myself. I have an academic background, and I've worked more in the startup scene. And generally in the startup scene, you don't often start with banking applications because that's like pretty mind-bogglingly complex. I do, however, work with my startup with student data, so assignments, grades, submissions, those kinds of things. And that's still pretty mission critical. That's not stuff you want to put out in public or you want to accidentally delete, because then students have a big problem. So we do have some strategies in place to help us make sure that we avoid problems with data. And of course with security. So a couple of things. I mean, there's like the standard things you can do, right? Like anybody can tell you that you should write tests for your software in order to make sure that there are no bugs. And of course, if you're building a web-based platform, you're also going to have to make sure that the basic security things are in place, like SSL connections and setting the right security headers. These things are also being updated every year. Making sure that you're using the latest version of security certificates, those kinds of things. But there are a couple of other things that we also do. For example, one thing is that we like to do a regular data integrity test. So we're not just testing the software, we're also testing the data. For example, if you have, in our case, a system for students and assignments, well, then you would expect that in the database, if you have, let's say, an assignment document, that it should have a valid student ID associated with it. So you can run a test every day, every week, whenever you want, to verify that this link exists and that the student is actually a valid document and that the assignment is also a valid document. So that's just a simple check that you can do. And those are things that you can't always detect by writing tests, because then you're not testing the data, then you're testing behavior. But of course, all kinds of things can go wrong. So you have to check also that your data has integrity. And we just make like a huge list of those kind of basic checks to make sure that the data that we have, that it's valid and that there are not like weird glitches in it or something. And that helps, because sometimes if you have something missing, it might actually have a consequence in your code that you're going to break like a second thing. Like, for example, if you don't have a student associated with an assignment, but then you are going to assign that student a grade, then maybe your system crashes because there is no student, right? So that's really helped us a lot. And the second thing we also do, and that has also helped us track down problems, is that we don't just do the thing, but we also make a record of the things that we did. So what I mean is that you don't just perform the action and write that in code, but that you also keep track of what has happened. And I don't mean just logging, but I mean having actually a system of kind of events or transactions in place. And this is also what, of course, they do in lots of banking systems. And the reason you want to have these transactions in place is that it helps you to not just see the current state, which is maybe a state in error or something, but you can also see what led up to that state. And that also helps in finding problems. And potentially, if there is an issue, you can backtrack and undo some of the things that you did. Finally, a third thing that we also do is that when we have to perform some kind of critical operation, that I structure the code kind of like the first part is checks, basically checking that everything is ready in order to perform that operation, so that I'm sure that the operation itself can be run without any issues. So is there a valid student ID? Do we have are the dates correct? Whatever kind of validation logic that you need to do in order to make sure that the actual operation runs fine. And then that also reduces the chance of ending up with some kind of error halfway the operation, and then you don't know how to get back to the previous state that was still acceptable. So those are some kinds of examples of what we do to help us avoid problems. And I expect, I don't develop banking application myself, but I expect that they will also have a lot of these kind of features used in banking applications. So, second question, Sil asks, can you please make a video about refactoring a Django project, or should I say code roast? I am actually working on a new code roast video, so that's coming up in a few weeks. I still have to do the actual refactoring myself before I can record a video. So I don't do the refactoring completely unprepared, but that's going to be a couple of weeks up, but there is going to be another code roast video. Matthias writes, I'd like to see examples on how to test HTTP API calls. Yeah, that's a nice topic suggestion as well. I've been using Postman as the tool for that. It's really useful. You can define like whole sets of testing API requests, and that works actually pretty well. If you're following more of a layered architecture for your API system, then you will probably also have a routing layer, which is actually what provides the endpoints for your API. And you will have an operations layer, which contains the actual actions that are performed when you call the API. So then you can also write tests for the operations and then separate that from the routing part. But that's definitely something that I think could be interesting to do more videos about. Another question. Hey Arjan, is it possible to make a video about how to nail coding interviews or learn data structures and algorithms? So, two very different questions. I think there's kind of an assumption in there that you're going to get lots of data structure and algorithms questions in code reviews or in code interviews. I'm not sure that's still the case. Maybe some companies still do that, but in my company, we work differently. We don't want people to, I don't know, develop a binary tree or something like that. That's not really what we're looking for. I think you also see that software development is changing and that we move from writing ourselves a lot of low-level algorithms to more a job of patching up systems. We're more and more using frameworks, like if you're using Django or if in TypeScript you're using React, Material UI, etc., etc. You're much more tied to those particular frameworks, and they will already solve a lot of those basic issues for you. You don't have to write all that code yourself. So honestly, I think purely data structure algorithm questions, unless that's really the core of the job that you're going to be doing, I'm not really sure that it's going to be very, very useful in interviews. I do think it's important that in interviews you display an understanding of how things work and how things are patched up. And I mean, if you're doing web development, if you are applying to a web development job, for example, then it helps to know a bit of React and being able to cook up a simple website in a few steps. So I guess depending on the type of software development job, the requirements are going to be different. But I can definitely do a video about coding interviews and give some tips on how to help you with that. All right, question by Magnus. What differentiates the entry, junior, medium, and senior Python developers levels? And at which levels algorithms data structures are required? Of course, I can Google such questions. Awesome. Me too. I just asked for your point of view. Okay. And you also miss code roast. Oh, yeah. Got it and working on it. Yeah, different levels. I mean, the strange thing about it is that everybody seems to assume that there is some kind of common understanding of this, but of course that's not true. Every company kind of interprets it differently. Yeah, how we do it, I think we view really junior developers, let's say as developers between 0 and 2 years of experience, media between 2 and 5, and senior more than 5, something roughly like that. But in the end, it's of course not about how many years you've done coding. It's about what you've learned and what you're capable of. And I think one of the main things that's important if you want to grow into a more senior role is that you're able to take a bit more responsibility and that you're able to come up with good solutions to problems yourself and are able to take steps yourself without having to rely on your manager to do those things. There's also a difference between, let's say, a senior engineer and a lead engineer, I would say, in that the lead engineer has a management component. So you're supervising interns or a whole development team. Whereas with the senior developer, it's more about having really in-depth knowledge about all aspects of software development. So I'd say that a junior engineer I would really see as somebody that has maybe experience with one particular kind of technology, like you're very good at programming in Python, for example. But as you grow more senior, you will have learned lots of other different technologies, like doing backend work or knowing a bit about cloud infrastructure or knowing a second or a third programming language and being able to develop applications in that too. And it's not just about the skill, it's also about the general knowledge that you get out of that and being able to to apply that knowledge to different domains. All right, question by Stuart. When doing test-driven development, do you ever use the transformation priority premise? I actually had to look up what you meant by that, but as far as I understand it, it's more a mechanism of refining the code step by step and moving from a more specific level to a more generic level. I wouldn't really say that I do that explicitly. It's something that also kind of happens automatically, where you start by basically solving a very specific problem, and then step by step you try to find a more general solution that still software design-wise makes sense. I noticed that it's, for me, often the way that I write code. I start by really implementing something very specific, and then I think, okay, wait, but if I modify this a bit, if I refactor this a bit, then I can probably solve it or change it to solve a more generic problem. It's actually something that happens to me today because I was reworking a bit the invoicing system I use for my online course. So if you buy my online course, which, by the way, is going up in price, but that's if you want to get in at the current price, you can still do it this week. But anyway, what I do is that I have a system where I generate an invoice. So I do some API calls to my accounting system, basically. And I'm thinking about moving or also adding PayPal as a payment option. So then it's a bit different. So I have to generalize the code that I currently wrote that uses Stripe. So in that sense, that's kind of what's happening. You start with specific solution to a problem, but then you try to generalize it and change the design to support that. Right, let me go to a few questions from the chat. So I'll just start at the top. First question I see here is, from Surjit, how do you handle a situation where everyone in your team is way smarter than you? Oh, that never happens to me, I don't know why. Kind of like imposter syndrome. Honestly, I think it's great if everybody in your team is smarter than you. You should try to get into a team where everybody is smarter than you, because that's just such a great opportunity to learn. And I think I think that's one of the issues with things like imposter syndrome. I mean, I also have imposter syndrome sometimes. When you're part of a team, and I mean, everybody's going to have different skills, but it's not a one-dimensional thing. It's not like you have like a staircase where everybody is a bit smarter than somebody else. I mean, some people are going to be further ahead in a certain area than other people. You might have somebody who's really an expert at writing tests, and somebody else might be an expert at DevOps, and yet somebody else might be really good at explaining topics and explaining programming concepts to somebody else. So it's not so much about being smart. It's about recognizing your own skills and having the confidence of using them, and not worry too much about, let's say, comparing yourself with other people, because that's not very, very useful. In general, though, if you are part of a team with lots of smart people, I think you are blessed, because it means that you can learn a lot from those people, and it really helps to surround yourself with people who are also ambitious and are open to sharing knowledge, because that's just a very powerful way to increase the speed at which you yourself learn new things. All right, let's see. How do you go about understanding legacy code? Yeah, that's sometimes problematic. Of course, when that happens, you need to revise some code that somebody else wrote years ago, and you have to try to figure out what it all means and get it to work. It happened to me a couple of times, mostly during my PhD, where I was starting on some research project, and the previous PhD students also worked on that. So then I was supposed to use that code, which of course the code was like incomprehensible, low-level C, which was really hard to follow. Well, one pretty extreme solution is to just start over. Sometimes that's the only way out of it. But if it's really not possible to do that, if it's like a more complex project, then I try to kind of split off things of the legacy code and look at those parts separately. So, if there is like some code that's grouped in a separate class, I try to refactor it a bit so that I can separate that code a bit from the rest and then analyze what's happening, maybe try writing a few test scripts to understand what that part of the code is exactly doing, adding documentation and doing some minor design improvements at the same time. And then you move on to the next part. And so part by part, you're kind of reviewing the code, modifying things a bit, cleaning up things a bit until it's in a place where it's going to be usable. And then you can just use it and start refactoring later on and making bigger improvements gradual as you move along. So that's how I would generally approach legacy code. Please do video on how to start to understand a large code base as a new engineer. Yeah, that's also interesting. It's also something that we run into at our own company. If we have, let's say, an intern that's starting, we have a pretty complex system at the moment with lots of front-end code, a pretty complicated back-end with various APIs and various services that are running. I think it's really important as you start as a new engineer with, let's say, a new job, is that you can't do that on your own. You can't be expected to just, here is the code and have fun with it and you figure it all out. So you need some kind of project to that is on the one hand kind of isolated, so that you don't have to know everything about the code, but you can at least get started and then gradually move into it more. What often is nice is that if you're a new engineer, that you start working on some kind of related side project that uses a part of the code of the main system. And then if it's a side project that's still interesting for the company, I think that's a great starting point. Let's see. I would be super happy if my colleagues are smarter than me. Yeah, me too. Wafistas asks, do you prefer object-oriented programming or functional? Yeah, neither. I'm actually pretty, I really don't like complicated inheritance hierarchies and the boilerplate code that's part of object-oriented programming. On the other hand, pure functional programming where there is no state and we have like all kinds of levels of higher order functions, which makes things also really hard to understand in my opinion, is also not the solution. I do like the simplicity of functional programming, of being able to talk about functions and treat them as independent entities. And of course, in a language like purely object-oriented language like Java or C#, this doesn't really exist. But in Python, this is different. Of course, in Python, you can just define a function and you're good to go. So I do prefer that aspect of functional programming. But classes and objects are also really useful for representing more structured data and having some typing information to help you understand what is going on and how the objects are structured. So I'm not a fan of using only one of those two things. I tend to use a combination. And for me, that works pretty well. If you've seen my recent videos, you also see perhaps that I'm kind of converging in that direction, where I use kind of a mix of a bit of everything, like data classes, but also partial function application. And I think if you pick the right tools for the right job, then it will work out fine. And the most important thing is not so much whether you should do object-oriented programming or functional programming. It's more about picking the right tool and making sure that it results in code that is as easy to test, as easy to change as possible, and hopefully also easy to read. All right, let's see, what else do we have? Maybe I should go back to the questions in the community post for a bit. So I'm going to scroll back up. Okay, question by Christensen Code. How do you profile Python code? Do you have any thoughts on using Docker to deploy Python code? What are you most excited about for the next major release of Python? So that's Python 3.11. So first, let's talk a bit about the first question. How do you profile Python code? Now, I've not worked extensively with really high performance Python code where I had to figure out the performance bottlenecks. So I don't think I'm in that sense really qualified to answer the question. I did do those things a bit more when I was working on my PhD work with animation systems, and I had to make sure that computations were done really efficiently. I must say, though, I didn't really use any official tools for that. I just analyzed and did, like in Python, you have things like timeit to just figure out how long things take and then try to optimize that a bit. But I'm not the kind of developer that optimizes everything until the extremes. That's not really the kind of area that I work in. The kind of applications that I develop are mostly, let's say, user interfaces, and then it doesn't matter if the button click is handled like a few microseconds sooner than if you wouldn't have optimized the code. So not really a good answer, I know, but I don't really have anything specific to recommend to you, so I prefer to just not do that. Do you have any thoughts on using Docker to deploy Python code? Well, yes. Docker is great. I use it all the time. There's no reason to also not use it for Python code. Actually, I use it for my backend to generate invoices for my course. So that's a Docker image that's running a Flask server. I'm going to do a video soon about a really interesting tool that helps with this. And there's a new thing, or it's not even that new, but it's still something that I don't think enough people know about, and I really want to start using it more, which is infrastructure as code. And that means that you're actually writing a Python script to define your cloud architecture. So what the services are that you're going to use, and what storage objects you're going to have, and you define that in code. And I think that's a really, really cool thing to use. And there's going to be a video in a couple of weeks where I talk about that in more detail, also give some examples about it. So and there I actually deploy also a Docker image with simple Python APIs. I'll show you exactly how to do it. What are you most excited about for the next release of Python? Well, there's like the next release, there's like a couple of different things. In particular, I think there are nice little improvements in the typing system of Python, which, you know, I'm a big fan of types, so I like those things. I will probably do a video about it once it comes out, just go through the different features and talk about that. There's also a new library for parsing TOML files, which is also nice. And there's a couple of other smaller things. What is, though, the most exciting thing I think about Python 3.11 is that it's going to be way faster than Python 3.10. So they note in the release highlights that it's about 10 to 60% faster, which is really, really cool. So I'm definitely going to do some tests and play around with it a bit, and I'll share my thoughts with you in a video. Alrighty, next question by Rui. Oh, not so much a question, more of a discussion topic. I've recently had the opportunity to start coding web applications in Flask, and I'm horrified how the code is all over the place. What does a good Flask architecture look like? Proper way to get the initial data for a page, where is code associated to a button supposed to go? What's a nice way of getting reusable web components that have some server logic inside? Okay, so lots and lots of detailed questions. Actually, I think Python is honestly not the ideal framework for front-end applications. So I know I did a dashboard example a couple of weeks ago, but I feel like technologies like React are actually more suitable for front-end applications. Now, there are, of course, a couple of basic architectures that you can use at a starting point, like, model view controller is one of the most important ones, where the key element is to try to separate the logic from the actual user interface components. And one thing that I see a lot in the code of companies that I review from time to time is that companies do work on separating things and splitting out code, but they forget that there is a possibility to add some abstraction, and like using protocol classes or abstract base classes. And that actually helps a lot in providing that extra level of separation, because then you can much more easily mock things and also run tests. So it's a lot cleaner to set it up in that way. Now, there's lots of processes for generating things like web pages, like when do you retrieve the information, and there's of course a balance between waiting for all the data and then showing the final UI versus showing something immediately, but showing like a progress loader or something like that. We're also struggling a bit with that aspect in our own application in my company. We're now experimenting a lot with these kind of skeleton interface elements. So you already see the interface, but it doesn't contain any data yet, and that helps. But there's still a ways to go. Also in React, for example, they're still working on asynchronous rendering, which is what you need for that kind of support. It's not an easy problem to solve, unfortunately. Next question by Michael. I've been using Fast API, and there's a strong preference to Pydantic classes. Can I just use that as a replacement for the data class? Well, yes. In fact, Pydantic, I did a video about Pydantic a while ago already. It has a lot of extra features. It has a lot of the same capabilities as data classes, but it also has things like validation, which is really useful. So you can definitely use that. There's another library which is called Attr, and this is actually what data classes that's built into Python is based on. Now, I haven't looked into detail into Attrs myself. I played around with it a bit, so I do want to cover it in more detail in another video and do a comparison between these three, because these are kind of the three main libraries that you see people use. So I'll come back to that. Let's see. We have more questions. Hi Arjan, I've been working with AWS Lambda functions a lot lately in Python. It would be great if you share your views on software design in Lambda functions. Yeah, so it depends very much on what you're designing, obviously. These kind of cloud functions are often used to just perform a relatively simple task. So you will probably not have very complicated logic behind it. Although if I look at some things like creating invoices can actually be quite complex. I think what's interesting about these cloud functions is that you kind of completely forget about the architecture and scaling. You don't have to worry about that anymore. So whereas let's say in the past we had microservice architectures where we're really trying to split up things into services that then communicate with each other. What's nice about these cloud functions, about Lambda functions, is that you start to split up your service into tasks, and if you can do that in a way that these tasks are, pretty independent, then you can actually have a pretty complicated architecture with lots and lots of different functions that do all kinds of different things, and without having too much coupling. So I think from an architecture point of view, that's interesting. Mike asks, in your video you suggest keeping object creation separate from object use via dependency injection. Often this isn't possible when using framework. That's definitely true. How about using an abstract factory instead? Also, I find that separating out creation essentially defers creation to the calling layer above, which might in turn be called from above, etc. So where do you finally create the object? Yeah, it's true that if you use frameworks, you're kind of marrying the framework, and that means you have to follow the way that the framework expects you to write the code. So it is limiting in a sense. One thing that we do is, for example, in our backend system, we do try to separate, I think I mentioned this in the beginning of the stream as well, we do try to separate the routing aspect, which is what mostly the framework is concerned with if you're using a backend framework, and the operations layer. So and then you can actually do things in the operations layer like dependency injection, because that's going to be more your own structure, your own code. And you can do, and then you can also write tests for that more easily. Now, you can't always completely separate those things. Sometimes you just have to do it within the framework, and then there's not really much you can do about it. If you look at where you should finally create things, ultimately, what is ideal is if you have, let's say, one dirty place in the code. I think Robert Martin also calls it like that, where you patch up everything. And normally this should be the main file. So, and you can even do this for more complex applications, because you can build layers of objects that are responsible for certain areas that then construct their own objects in turn. But in the end, you patch everything up at the top level. And that also means that you will have an area in your application where it's all about patching up and making all kinds of connections. And if you want to write tests for that, you can just replace some of those objects with mock objects, and that works pretty well for us. And it also means if creating those objects based on, let's say, configuration settings is also much easier, because then you have like one place, the top level of your application, where you also have to deal with configurations. All right, going back to a few chat questions again. Let's see, where are we? Glory to our Stotka asks, do you plan on making a video about negotiation, your salary, or videos discussing meta aspects of being a developer, hours of work, when to take a break, etc.? Yeah, this is definitely something I'm interested in. I've read a lot of books about self-improvement, Atomic Habits and those kinds of books, and I think some of those ideas we can also apply to software development. I don't want to turn into some kind of productivity guru or something. I'm not a productivity guru. I'm not that productive, actually. So I want to avoid that. But I will. I do have a section planned of where I have some video ideas of talking about things like how to work efficiently, and if you want to learn faster, what to focus on. There's actually a really great book by Viljane Hermans. She's a Dutch professor, and it's called The Programmer's Brain. And I'm reading it right now. It's really interesting. It's all about how our brains work and how we store information, how we retrieve information. And the way that our brains work is actually really interesting, in that we have a technique called chunking, where we are able to store and access information way faster by grouping things. And you do that, for example, if you read a sentence, you group letters so that you can form words and then you can remember the word. That's chunking, that's putting things together. And if you're doing programming, you're also using that exact same technique. So instead of reading all the characters in a piece of code, you understand if statements. And if you go even higher up, you may recognize design patterns and design principles like dependency injection. So it's really interesting, and I will probably do a video where I just talk about those kinds of topics in the future. So yes, definitely coming up. All right, Danilo asks, hi, which web framework do you use in your software design and mindset course? I'm using, I guess you're talking about the extension part. I think I'm using Fast API there and SQL Alchemy. Wonderboy, hello from Gorinchem. Hi. Hello from Beeldhoven. Stamatis says, greetings from Greece. Thank you for your videos. You're most welcome. Mohammed, thanks for everything. Ooh, that's a lot, everything. Wonderboy asks, will there be some Django topic? I have to think about it a bit. I've purposely not focused too much on diving into lots of frameworks on my channel. I like to keep things a bit more generic. You know, I like to talk a lot about software design, and I don't want to spend too much time just doing tutorials about specific frameworks, but since Django is really a popular framework, I might actually do that. And it might be interesting to build a Django application and looking at it a bit from a software design perspective. Me here, views on a normal monitor versus a curved one. I don't have experience with a curved monitor. I'm happy with a flat monitor, so I don't really have a view on that. And Mohammed asked, could you kindly make a video on how to structure a Python project better? Many thanks. Yeah, that's also a good suggestion. I've seen many of you ask that, so I'll definitely think about doing a video on that topic, because I do have some thoughts about it. Okay, next. What do you think about when it's a good time to learn another language like Go, Rust, C#? Is it enough to know one language to be a good, well-rounded software engineer? I have a bit conflicting view on it. On the one hand, most languages are really similar. I mean, unless you're really going into a different programming paradigm, like a functional programming with Haskell or something. But even then, there's still similarities. But I mean, if you look at languages like Python, Java, C#, C++, you know, you all have classes and functions, methods and variables and loops. So a lot of the concepts of programming languages don't really change. So you could say, okay, why the need to learn more than one programming language? What I found really interesting myself is I've programmed in lots of different languages. I don't know, well, Python, obviously, C#, Java, JavaScript, TypeScript, C, C++. I haven't done any Go programming, but and even some Pascal and BASIC when I was still a kid. I think what for me was the most valuable in trying other programming languages is experiencing almost like a cultural shift when you do that. Like every language has a slightly different way of dealing with imports and packages, and every language has a couple of specific features that are really typical for that language. You know, like Python with all the dunder methods and the possibility to change basically anything you like about the language. That's really a typical Python thing. So learning about that is actually, in my opinion, really helpful because it broadens your horizon. It's like, you know, you can live in one country and you can definitely be a well-rounded individual, and that's not an issue at all. But if you travel, if you visit other countries, other cultures that you experience, then you broaden your horizons, and it helps to put into perspective what you've been doing until now. So similarly, if you only program in one language, when you learn a second language, you start to see some of the disadvantages and some of the advantages of other languages that you've been using. And that's good. That gives you some perspective. So I definitely think it's good to know at least, let's say, 2, maybe 3 languages to start with. And after that, the effect is going to be less, this horizon broadening aspect. But it's still good to be aware of other languages and play around with it a bit. Okay. What are your views on Fast API? Yeah, I think it's really nice. I really prefer it over Flask, to be honest. I also think I believe they're working on lots of big changes at the moment. So I really look forward to see where the platform is going. Haroldo asks, hi Arjan, the course that you offer will evolve. I mean, more topic, languages, etc. At the moment, it's really Python focused. Of course, I did that for a reason because, well, on the channel I also talk most about Python, so I don't think it makes sense to then offer a course in TypeScript or something like that. Also, the programming language is not that important, to be honest. It's really a course about design principles, and you can apply those principles to any programming language. But I definitely evolved because I'm constantly tweaking. Recently I added an extra lesson about functions, I added extra exercises. So it's like a continuous changing thing, basically. That's actually the nice thing about a course like that. With YouTube, you post a video and that's it. You can't change the video afterwards. Well, you can cut out some pieces, but you can't really fundamentally change it. With the course, I can, revise things. I can replace videos by newer, better videos, learn from where everybody's struggling and then try to solve that. So it's really more of an evolving process, which I really like. Matteo, hey from Italy. How do you avoid over-engineering a solution and falling into a rabbit hole, so to speak, like applying too many design patterns, classes that might turn out to be overkill? That's something I commonly see happening, actually. What helps me a lot in trying to avoid that is to always think one step further. So when you're looking at your own code and you want to refactor and improve things, you maybe sense that there is some issue with your code. Don't just think, okay, what design principle should I apply here? Or am I applying the right design pattern? Or what would be the best approach to have dependency injection? So of course those things are important, but in the end that's not what it's about. In the end, you want to have code that's easy to change, so that you can add new features more easily, so that's going to be less work. You want code that's easy to test, so that it breaks less often, and that you can easily separate out things and make sure that they work correctly. And you need code that's easy to understand. So am I able to quickly see what is happening here? Does it make sense to do it in this way? So those are the real questions you should ask yourself. And I think by starting there and by focusing on those questions, you avoid a lot of the problems. Because as soon as you start over-engineering, it's going to hurt readability, or it might hurt how easy your code is to change. So instead of asking, hey, should I apply this pattern or should I apply this principle? Ask yourself, what if I were to swap out this framework by another framework? How much work would that be? Or suppose I want to make sure that this code is completely bug-free. How would I have to write tests for this? And how can I change it to make that easier? Or you could ask yourself, hey, if I show this this code to a junior engineer who has no knowledge of this particular project, is it clear to them? Can they understand what this is about? And what can I do to make that easier to follow? So that's where I think if you start there, you're going to make your life way easier. And then the design principles, the design patterns are the tools. It's like a carpenter, like who's building a house, right? He's not thinking, should I use a hammer or should I use a screwdriver? No, he thinks like, okay, I want to construct a door frame, and then what are the steps to get the door frame finished? And then he picks the tools that he needs. He doesn't worry about the tools. So design patterns, design principles are tools. Don't worry about them, but if you know about them, you're going to automatically use them to achieve those higher goals of writing code that's easier to understand, easy to change, easier to test. That's my view on it, in any case. Let's see. Can you create a video series on different architecture designs and deployment strategies? Yeah, maybe not particularly a series, but I am definitely going to do more about deployment and about cloud architecture. I think it's a nice topic to add to my channel. So I already started doing that. I did a Docker video a while ago, and there's going to be a cloud deployment video later in a few weeks. I also want to look at things in the future like GitHub Actions and do some videos about that to explore how to set that up properly and make that easy to manage. So definitely it's something that I'm really interested in. All right, let's see, what else do we have? Just have to scroll up a bit. Somehow the chat window scrolled all the way down. Ajay, hey, greetings from Hoofddorp. Greetings back. I like how you can lift a method from class, drop it into the shell, and call it by adding instance as argument. Oh, that's probably a reply to somebody else. Mr. Robot, why should someone study a master, at least Master of Science? I guess you mean in computer science. That's a good question. Of course, it depends very much on what you want to do. I think if you want to become, let's say, a web developer at a company, or let's say more a position like that, I'm not sure that a master is actually a good choice for you, because a lot of what you're going to do is going to depend on practically using certain frameworks and knowing about that, and that's not really what a master is about. A master is really about going more in depth into a particular computer science topic. So if that's your goal, then I don't think doing a master is a good idea. If on the other hand you're planning to go more into a kind of research direction, and it also includes things like data science, for example, then it helps to get a bit of extra fundamentals, and going a bit deeper with the master studies can help there. So it depends on what you want to do. Let's see. Hello from Baku. What are you doing when someone in your team refuses to write tests? So then you refuse to accept the pull request. I mean, I think there's another issue here. If somebody just flatly refuses to write tests, while as a team you decided that it's important that you write tests, then I think you need a discussion among each other about setting your priorities straight. It's not about punishing, but it's about making sure that everybody understands why tests are important. Because if somebody's refusing to do that, clearly they don't understand why this is important for your team. So you need to talk about that. What do you dislike the most about developing in Python coming from other languages? I had to get used to a couple of things. Like in the beginning, I really hated that tabs that indentation has a meaning in Python. I really hated that, and it got me into trouble a couple of times. So that's I still not really like that. I mean, I kind of understand why. It does result in shorter code. You don't need those braces anymore surrounding everything. So I guess that's nice, but they never really bothered me in other programming languages. So I don't like invisible things like tabs and white spaces to have meaning in my program, basically. So I didn't really like that. Also, actually, I think one of the biggest issues I currently have with Python is the honestly pretty broken and half-implemented type system that it has. I mean, there's some good ideas there, like having a structural typing approach using protocol classes, for example. I really like that aspect of typing, but I think Python should be way more strict with types. And I think all the built-in libraries in Python should fully support typing. And in particular, the bigger open source libraries like pandas, etc., should also, I think, really work on that, because in the end, it's really important tool for developers to make writing code easier. And I think I kind of guess where that's coming from, because I mean, initially Python was not really intended to write complex applications with. It's more of a scripting tool, but it's morphing into something different now. You see that Python is being used more and more for bigger code bases. Data science code is becoming more complex. We have all the machine learning and AI stuff happening. So I think Python should grow up as a language, have a strict mode where you're not allowed to not have types, where certain donder methods that change the core of how things like inheritance works are basically prohibited to use, and a couple of things like that. Just some guardrails for developers to work within. The price you pay is that you have less flexibility, but what you will gain is a lot more clarity and better integration with your IDE. So I do think that's definitely worth it. So yeah, that's what my main criticism is on Python at the moment. All right, let's see. After watching a video, I can tell that employing things like design patterns can make code better. How do you gain the intuition to write good code from the start? Rules of thumb or experience? Yeah, it's like, I mean, a lot of the design patterns, like the classic design patterns, I mean, they also came from experience from the authors of that famous design patterns book. Like they noticed like common structures in the way that they set up code. And you're going to, you know, when you become more experienced as a developer, you're going to come up with your own kind of little standard solutions for things, or standard ways of doing things that you're going to reuse over and over again because they just work well. And that's also what I noticed, that I don't always use directly as let's say precisely the way that you're supposed to use a design pattern. On the one hand, because, well, I have my own way of doing things, sometimes a bit differently, but in the end with the same effect. But also, the design patterns book is like 30 years old. I mean, it's a great book, and at the time it was like mind-blowing to have this. But we also see that programming languages evolve, and we get lots of new features. And I think we should think about what those patterns look like when you use those new features instead. So what does a strategy pattern look like when we use protocols? Or what happens if you replace part of the bridge pattern by higher order functions? So there's lots of possibilities that potentially result in code that has the same kind of decoupled aspect that you get with when you use design patterns, but at the same time also uses more modern features. All right, let's see, what else do we have? I am asked, how do you go from intermediate Python person? I like that. I think that should be a job title, right? I'm an intermediate Python person. And where was I? Oh yeah, a few big science app for you need to a competent, career-ready software person. I think if you are an intermediate Python person, you are already quite far ahead of starting with a career. I think for me, one of the biggest things, let's say, that I noticed when moving from academics to a company is the whole practical aspect. I mean, at university, also if you're a teacher at university, you learn a lot about, let's say, the fundamentals of computer science. So you know all about, I don't know, for loops and design principles, even design patterns, those kind of things. That's all theory. But the practical knowledge of, say, if you want to deploy an app, then you're going to use this particular cloud setup, or what, let's say, the common modern technologies are to do certain things. That's not what you learn in university. So if you want to move into a software development career, I think it helps to at least create for yourself, let's say, a small little practical project which ties a lot of different things together, and that helps you explore what the common technologies are, what the modern things are that everybody's using nowadays. And then you will also be able to start, let's say, paid projects or work as software developer at a company sooner, because you have that extra knowledge. Sibren, have you worked as a freelance developer, and how was it different as opposed to working in a regular job with a company? No, I have not really worked as a freelance developer, except just a little bit during my studies. I think I wrote a system so that other students could hand in reports and that the teacher could view those reports. But other than that, I don't have experience as a freelance developer, so I don't really feel qualified to answer this question. Luke asks, do you build websites? If so, what is your tech stack? Yes, I do build websites. We have at my company, a pretty complex web platform. So the tech stack is that we're using TypeScript, React, Material UI for the front end. This all runs in Google Cloud. We use Next.js as the tool that helps us do things like all the boilerplate around creating a project, doing server-side rendering, those kinds of things. Well, works really well. I'm really happy with that. I do think that if I were to start over again, I might not use React. I think there's a couple of cool technologies nowadays that I would definitely want to explore more, like Svelte and Vue. But React is actually working pretty well for us. So that's the front end. On the back end, we use that's also TypeScript, Node.js, and we have a GraphQL backend. So we use Apollo for both the client side and the server side. So that does all the data caching and things like that. It's really nice. All right. Let's see. We have Diego. Uncle Bob does not defend any language, but instead have a whole understanding about solving problems and picking a language that better fits that problem. What's your opinion on that? Yeah, I mean, if you look at different programming languages, you can't look at the programming language itself independently. Basically, it's always that the language has often been designed for a specific purpose. So with Python, for example, it came really from scripting. So that's very different than a language like Java, which was intended to be cross-platform, and so that has very different roots, and therefore the language is also better at certain things than other languages. So of course you should pick the best tool for the job, and the language in the end is nothing more than a tool. So if you look at what being a computer scientist means, it's not about being an expert at one particular language. It's I totally agree with Uncle Bob that it's about understanding and solving problems. I think it's one of the greatest skills you can develop as a computer scientist. And it's also something that's, when you do a computer science studies, that is there kind of beneath the surface, but it's not really explicit during your studies, that it's in the end all about being able to analyze a problem and being able to cut it up logically in pieces and then solving those pieces. And I think that's what 90% of computer science is all about. And that can be a handy skill for programming, but also for other things. I really noticed that when somebody has a more technical background, that they're also often able to more logically analyze certain complex problems. And I think that's a really important skill you develop as a computer scientist. That does not really directly have anything to do with computer science, but just with being a logical person that is able to have good analysis skills. It's all about analysis skills. Let's see. Yeah, so Luke, infrastructure as code versus Terraform. Yeah, I mean, that is indeed the big difference. That's if you look at infrastructure as code, and actually specifically a tool like Pulumi, which lets you develop or construct your architecture by just writing code, is very different from Terraform, where you're still specifying the architecture in configuration files. I mean, one of the really cool things of infrastructure as code is that you can actually use programming features and software design to set up the way that you define your architecture. So you can group, let's say, architecture components in functions, and then when you call the function, it creates all those resources. Or you can use class inheritance to create specific versions of specific resources. You can dynamically, depending on configuration settings, change things in your architecture. You can even imagine doing something like deploying a server that contains infrastructure as code. That doesn't make any sense, but that actually dynamically adapts your whole cloud architecture based on, I don't know, usage statistics and stuff like that. So I think when we get there, we can really do a lot of cool things with the idea of that infrastructure is actually code. So I'm really excited about it. Giuseppe, should I learn programming? Yes, you should. Have you worked with the C++ interface with Python? That's my next thing to learn. Yeah, I did that in the past, a long time ago, where I made an interface with the DLL. We were working on a sort of game engine that was kind of before you had Unity and Unreal Engine, but we were, as a research group, working on our own kind of virtual environment system. So we needed the graphics part to be very performant, but we still wanted to have control over which characters to load, which environments to load, which animations to play, and things like that. So we built a graphics engine in C++, and then we used Python as a scripting layer on top of that. And that actually worked pretty well. I mean, the tool is no longer under development, of course. There's like much better tools, commercial tools available nowadays. But that's what I contributed to in the past. It's really interesting to work on something like that. Nico asks, what do you think about static typing in Python? Yeah, I think one of the powers of Python is that the whole structural typing idea. I think that's a really nice way of approaching typing, especially like protocol classes a lot. And in general, I do like type hints. I just like them to be more strict so that I can actually fully rely on them. And I also hope that other tools start to use them more, so that it's that the job of developing a more complex application in Python becomes a bit easier. All right, let's see. Have you used other front-end frameworks than React? Yeah, I did in the past a couple of things with Angular and jQuery before that. So React was a very welcome change. Vue I have not used a lot. I did a few tutorials with it myself just to play around with it a bit, similar to Svelte. I also played around with that a bit. But I mean, the thing is that once you pick like a platform to use, and we picked React at the time when we started the company, it's also really hard to change. And it's actually why I like doing the YouTube channel, because that lets me do stuff in Python, which I'm not doing in my company. So it helps me, keeps me sharp, basically. I am secretly thinking about at some point maybe starting a second channel. Although that's a lot of extra work, but I would really like to do a bit more on web development and looking at a couple of these different frameworks and, make a kind of evil universe, alternate universe, ArjanCodes on web development channel or something. I think that could be cool. But I have to find more time for that before I can do that. I am, by the way, slowly transitioning out of my startup company, and ultimately my plan is to just focus fully on ArjanCode stuff. But that's going to take a while. But when I'm there, I think I want to do something extra, not just the Python channel that I have now, but perhaps also have something that focuses on web development. All right. Let's see. Any plans to create a course discussing how to build software at scale? Actually, yes. It's going to be a bit different, though. I think I actually reserved a domain called softwareatscale.com. I'm going to do something with that next year. But it's not. I don't want to do like a classic course because I think building software at scale requires a more personalized approach. So I'm thinking of setting up a program where it's more set up like a, let's say, group coaching session, where it's like with a small group of people, but really intense personal feedback, code reviews, having some more coaching aspects, and helping people to basically build more complex products, and also do some sparring about startup ideas and things like that. I think that could work, but I don't have like a complete idea about it yet. I'm still mulling it over, and so I'll definitely come back to that later this year. Let's see. Good idea to build a large-scale backend service with fast API. I think so. I think Fast API is a nice tool, and Python. I like actually using Python for backend stuff. I think it's pretty easy to set up, and especially once Python 3.11 is out, it's also going to be pretty fast. So I think that will work fine. The only thing you have to take care of is make sure that that if you build something on a larger scale, that you're also thinking a bit about the design of your code, so that you're not having like huge files with lots of lines of code, but that is split out a bit. Any programming books you'd recommend? Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned them before, like the Bob Martin books, like Clean Architecture and Clean Code. They're nice. But the one that I'm really like now is the Programmer's Brain that I'm reading at the moment. I think if you're a software developer, it's highly recommended to read this. It's really nice. It's kind of a different view on how you think, how you work as a programmer. It's really, really interesting. Mish asks, how to properly manage your work time? Yeah, this is it's a general thing you have to be a bit careful about. I think there's a lot of aspects to it. It also depends a lot on the kind of team you work in and what the culture is at your job. I know that in many startups or in game companies, you have like it's almost standard to just work like 6 days a week and evenings and weekends, etc. Personally, I'm not a fan of that. I think it's ultimately detrimental to you personally to do that. You need a good work-life balance. Because if you don't take rest, then you can't be a top performer at your job either. And I explicitly plan for myself time to do that. So I'm quite strict myself about separating work from private home stuff. So I don't work at home. Well, I did a bit last weekend with a launch of a new course extension, but normally it will rarely happen that I do a lot of work in the weekend. And you have to take care of also taking a break. I like to take a walk from time to time. I think that really helps me clear my thoughts. So approach your job and who you are a bit more holistically, and you're not your job, right? So and if you want to, let's say, have a positive impact, then it's important that you're also happy and that you're able to balance things properly. And ideally, find a team, find a company that understands this and that supports you in this. No Stomor, thank you for making me a better coder. You're welcome. Happy to oblige. As to how your brain perceives, if you ever had a chance, I would recommend ecological approach to visual perception. Oh, thank you for the recommendation. I will write this down. It sounds interesting. There's a lot of these books also about cognitive psychology, on how people observe things, and it's really interesting stuff. So definitely worth reading about. What's your preferred test framework? I was for a long time a fan of unit test because it was simple and built into Python. But I must say that lately I've not been using that anymore, and I'm fully using PyTest. And on top of that, I've also been using Hypothesis more and more, which is a property-based testing framework, which is really cool. I'm actually planning to do a follow-up video about Hypothesis and specifically dive a bit deeper into model-based testing. I'm actually in contact with the main engineer working on Hypothesis, so we might do something together soon. Charles asks, I'm developing an application that generates cities for games like Pathfinder and Dungeons & Dragons, and I've used a ton of different techniques from videos, and it's cooking along so well. Thank you. Oh, so that was not a question, but you're welcome. Will there be more code roast videos? Yes, there definitely will be more code roast videos. I'm working on one right now that will come out in probably a month. I'm still struggling a bit with the format. I noticed that on YouTube, as soon as I start cutting up videos in part 1, 2, 3, etc., it doesn't really work that well. So I will probably stick to single videos and then trying to put the whole roast into a single video. Let's see how that works out. But yes, there will definitely be more. Can you do series on event-driven programming with Kafka? Yeah, that's also something that I am interested in. I've written down this idea also already a while ago. So yeah, definitely consider this. Are there any common weaknesses you see in junior developers? Well, common weaknesses, I mean, in part it's of course about just gaining more experience. But what I mostly notice is that, especially as a junior developer, you don't really have yet that bird's eye view of the entire application, and so it's hard to, as a junior developer, to come up sometimes with a good solution because you don't know the entire context of what you're working in. So that's sort of a limitation that I see often. And another thing I often see is that junior developers have a tendency to, if they get a task, They just do the task and don't think beyond the task or let's say the effects or side effects of what they're doing. So it's more of a, let's say, a limited view, very focused on the problem. Whereas if you become more senior, you think more about the bigger picture and how everything fits together. Let's see, Jacob, do you know anything about PyScript? Did you try it out? I haven't tried it yet. I think it's interesting to be able to run Python code in the browser. I mean, I'm guessing it's built on WebAssembly. I'm not even sure. Let me just look that up. Yeah, so it relies on WebAssembly. So it's kind of, you transform your Python code into low-level JavaScript code, WebAssembly, and then that's how it works. I think the whole WebAssembly thing is interesting, and I'm curious to see what comes out of it. I mean, what's kind of confusing always is that we don't know anymore what the browser is and what it's supposed to do, because sometimes a website is really just a simple website, a page with information, and sometimes it's really an application like Gmail or something, or you can run games in your browser. So I'm curious to see where all of that is going, and it's honestly, web at the moment is a bit of a mess because of that. And I mean, then you still have like compatibility issues between the different browsers, especially Safari and Chrome. It's always something going on, why something is not working in one of the two. So yeah, it's still a bit messy. I don't see myself using PyScript in a large-scale project or something. I mean, it's a nice gimmick, I'd say, but who knows? Maybe it will become like the new language for the web. Who knows what's going to happen? So let's see. Do you have any Python GitHub repositories you recommend reading as an example of a good library setup? That's actually an interesting question. I can't give you an answer right now, but it might be something I could look into in a video and do like a review of an existing library and also show some of the good things. Yeah, nice, thanks. Do you use CLI framework in Python? Not really at the moment. I'm not really building CLI tools at the moment, but it is interesting. Let's see. Sebastian, John, thank you for your great tutorials. Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you for joining the chat today. All right, let's see. We have Alfonso ask, what's your opinion on free and open source projects? Yeah, I mean, this is like the more or less standard way that a lot of software is being developed nowadays. I think one of the big advantages is that you have a community of people that are contributing to the code. The code is out in the open. I think that's for certain applications, that's really important. So I think it's a great way to develop software. I think an issue with open source projects is that there's not always clear accountability. So this is actually a real problem in the JavaScript world, where you have like tons and tons of node modules. But then at some point, somebody built a node module to do something, and that becomes very popular. But then that person just leaves and has other priorities and doesn't properly transfer it to somebody else. And then we're stuck with millions and millions of projects that are relying on that particular library, and then somebody has to make a fork, and it becomes a bit of a mess. So I do think that's an issue with some of the open source software out there. But, that's also a small price to pay for what it has allowed us to do, because I don't think I would have been able to build the company that I have at the moment, or the product that we have at the moment, if there was no open source software. So it's a really crucial component for especially smaller companies and startups to still be able to do good work. And I think that's important. We shouldn't lose that perspective. All right, so Justin asked, how do you think is the best way to make SQL reusable? I've seen templating, query builders, ORMs, but haven't really found something that feels right. Yeah, I think the best starting point is an ORM, like SQL Alchemy, for example. That's pretty common. In my company, we don't use a SQL database, but a NoSQL database, MongoDB. So that's then again a bit different. I mean, you typically want to avoid like injection attacks and things like that. So you don't want to write like low-level raw SQL strings, preferably. And I've used also query builders like Knex in JavaScript, which is also nice. I'm a bit on the fence on it. I'm not sure whether a query builder is better or whether an ORM is better. I think the advantage of a query builder is that, you know, SQL language has lots of, is quite powerful. And so why would you then write another like ORM layer on top of that so that you don't have to use that very powerful language? It doesn't make a lot of sense. But because if you have that language like SQL, there is also very little structure. So it's also important that there are some helpful tools. So that's why ORM or query builders are helpful. So yeah, I don't know. It's I guess it also depends on what kind of application you want to develop and how complex your queries are. You know, if you just use a few simple queries, then maybe an ORM is quicker to set up for you than a query builder. Bastian, hey, Arjan, do you think it's better to create an object, an instance of a class in a module namespace as a constant, or in a function namespace as a factory function? I wonder where this question is coming from. The thing is, I would avoid I would be very careful with where you create your objects. So I wouldn't do it, let's say, in the module namespace if possible, because you're kind of polluting the namespace with too many objects. So you have to be a bit careful. And if let's say you have a file, a Python module, and you create directly an object there, it means that if you import that file, then that import already results in you creating an object. And I think that doesn't give you enough control over when objects are created. And you do need a lot of control on when to create objects, because if you want to write tests, you need to know which objects are being created where, in what order, and you might want to create different objects instead. Joni, do you have any interest in doing stuff about interfacing with humans? This is interfacing with humans, right? We're interfacing right now. It's kind of the missing field, the actual point where what computers do help humans. How do you know it's helping, etc. Yeah, so the human-computer interface. For a minute, I thought you were thinking about neural links and how to interface with the brain and write some Python code to, I don't know, change the speed of your heartbeat or something. I'm not that interested in that aspect. I do like topics like user experience and design. I think those are really important in how we feel with connecting with technology and using technology. And I've really a lot of respect for, let's say, companies that do a good job. And I think a lot of companies, when they develop tools, they think too much in terms of the features, like what do I want the tool to do, and less about how can I make the task as easy as possible and as hands-off as possible for the user. And I noticed in the way that in my company we work with developing new features and working on the user interfaces that we typically need almost twice as many iterations as we'd expect if we really want to optimize the user experience. So it's a lot of work actually to do that properly, but it also pays off in the end, because in the end it's really important. Now, I didn't do a lot of videos about design in that sense, UI design. I might do some of that in the future. I did one video a long time ago that did really not so well about design tips, but I'm not sure it fits directly within the topic of the channel to talk about that. But it is interesting. I personally find it interesting. All right, let's see. Alec, something different. I'm a DevRel advocate and use Python, as I hope more people can understand my examples. Okay, yeah. Any guidelines on writing clear, simple code rather than scalable and correct programs? That's the art of stripping away everything that you don't need. If it's really about providing examples, well, you can leave off the imports. It's not really clear. Does it need to work? Is it actually code that needs to work, or is it more like pseudocode that you want to show to people? It depends a bit on that, obviously. But writing clear, simple code, yeah, of course, think about variable names. Be careful with the syntactical constructs that you use, and make sure that the program in itself is, pretty straightforward and doesn't use too many advanced concepts. If you split up things more into functions, then that also becomes easier, because your pieces of code are going to be shorter, because they will rely on other functions. So I would really focus on those aspects. All right, let's see. Jovid asks, what's your favorite Python framework? I mean, there's lots of frameworks, of course. I like Fast API. I have not really used Python frameworks a lot for front-end code. Like I did some tests with Dash, and there's also Streamlit that I want to look into a bit more closely, which also seems nice. Yeah, those I like to use a lot. And Python, I'm mainly building some backend services at the moment, so that's what I'm mainly interested in the moment. Camila asks, would you say that a well-tested application should have less logs? Not particularly. I think logs have different purposes. I mean, one purpose is that you want to know what's going on, and sometimes that's helpful in detecting bugs. Of course, you could put breakpoints in your code. That's like the more common way of detecting bugs, but sometimes that's not possible. If you have deployed code to your backend service in the cloud, then you can't set breakpoints, and you need logs to figure out what happens and what is happening in your service. So I think logs are important, and it's independent of whether an application is well tested or not. If it's not tested, they can be extra helpful because they're going to point out issues in your code. But if it's well tested, you still need logs. Have you considered making Java content? I'm just skipping a few questions, sorry. Yes, I have, and I will not do that for the moment. I mean, it's a nice language, but in my opinion, a bit verbose. I think I'm more interested in maybe some of the newer languages, like Rust, for example. So I'd like to look more into that. And I've also currently I'm still writing a lot of TypeScript code, so that's also an area that I have a bit more experience in. So I would sooner opt for that if I wanted to do videos about a separate language. But I'm a bit struggling with this because I'm not sure if, I mean, I tried some different things in the past where I had some Python videos and some TypeScript videos, and that didn't really work too well for my channel. I noticed that people are, if they're interested in Python stuff, so they come to my channel, which is great. But then if I do TypeScript videos, then it's less interesting for them, even though some concepts can be generic. So if I do another language, I will probably start a second channel for that. All right. Let's see. Patrick, any reason for diagnosis? Email not arriving. Tried 3 times together. Okay, just send a message to support@arjancodes.com and I'll sort it out for you. Then let's see. What are your thoughts about pandas in production? It seems pretty slow. Any tips on processing large files? Yeah, those are more, I'd say, data science questions. I have some experience with pandas myself, but not that much. I haven't built like large production code using pandas or something. I mean, there's like some common things you can probably do to make processing data a bit faster and a bit more stable by using things like batching and splitting up files and things like that. But I haven't done a lot of work in that area myself. Qt is the good choice to build on apps with UI. I think it works pretty well, Qt. There is, I think, a difference between the open source version and they also have like a commercial version. So I'm not sure if the open source version is complete. You do always have to be careful with UI frameworks that you're not polluting all of your code with UI concepts. So that you're not directly relying on constants that are defined in Qt everywhere, because then you can't use that code in another setting anymore. And it also makes it harder to test. Let's see. Then did you write? Have you done any instructional video about logging? That really trips some people up. Yeah, I think it would be nice to do a video about logging and also logging services and how to do that. I did a video already a while ago about. I think that was one of my first videos on the channel about event systems, which is a bit related, where you want to basically have like some kind of event queue that you're posting things to, and you can also integrate that with logging. Yeah, I think that could be nice to do a video about logging in more detail. Yeah, good suggestion. Let's see, what else do we have? What do you think, that's Avazad, what do you think about using decorators to register handlers like in Flask or Allogram? I mean, the problem with imports and global variables. Yeah, I'm not a fan of decorators, to be honest. I think in some cases they're useful, in very limited applications, like I do think they're useful for data classes, for example, because they're kind of low-key and you just write them on top of the class. But sometimes I feel like decorators are really screwing up the way that you set up your code. Like, for example, Hydra uses decorators to load configuration files, but then it inserts an argument into the function that you write the decorator above. So then you suddenly get all kinds of type issues, because you have to call the function without any arguments, and then Hydra is going to insert the arguments, but then the types don't match anymore. So I think that's just a really bad way of doing it. And also, I feel like if you're not careful with decorators, they hide a lot of functionality, and then you start having things where you put like 3-4 different decorators on top of a function, and you have no idea anymore what's happening in what order. So be careful with them. Let's see. There is Another question, Any by Oasis 1272. Any tips on the best way to implement code when you are the only person on a team who knows programming? If you're the only person in the team that knows programming, you can basically do whatever you want. You have to be careful, though, if you're really the only person, that you make sure that you're not getting completely overloaded, because everybody is going to come to you with their problems and feature requests, and can we change this and can we change that? The issue is also that if you're the only one who knows programming, then you're also the only one that knows the complexity of doing something, of changing something. And people don't always understand what is easy to change in terms of software development and what is much harder to change. And sometimes the thing that looks like it's supposed to be simple is actually going to be really complex, and the other way around. So if you're the only developer, you have to really make sure that you're clearly communicating how much time things cost, and that you're making sure that your teammates recognize that some things are just not going to be possible or going to require a huge amount of work. So you have to protect yourself a little bit. Jonas, would you consider a video series on software development where you show development of a fully working solution? This is actually something I noticed with YouTube. I know that I've done that in the past, like video series where I have like a part 1 and a part 2 and a part 3, etc. The problem is that this kind of setup, I've noticed it simply does not work well on YouTube. YouTube really views videos as kind of like isolated things that are independent. And if you have like multi-part series, it performs really bad. For the YouTube algorithm actually really hates them, so it won't push out parts 2 and part 3, etc. I've seen channels that have actually been completely basically killed by doing that, by creating like 80-part series, and then by part 80 nobody's watching anymore. And so that's also the issue, that for a lot of people, how you navigate YouTube is that you just you see videos and you click on videos that you think are interesting. And then having multi-part videos is dangerous, because on the one hand, people don't want to watch such a long series of videos, so they just skip the multi-part videos. And the other thing is that the people that do watch part 1 and maybe part 2, they start to drop off after each part, which means that progressively each video is going to do worse. So it's actually really bad to do these kinds of multi-part videos on the YouTube channel. And though I do like them myself, I think it's nice to provide like extra depth. YouTube just isn't the right platform for it, unfortunately. Let's see. AJ, congrats on your YouTube success. I've learned a lot from your videos, but one thing that I struggle with is testing. I watch your video on testing, but could you make a starting PyTest unit test series? Yeah, so testing, it's really an important skill to learn. It's also really hard to get right and to take those first steps in doing it right. So I definitely want to revisit testing and do more videos about it. I did have a 2-part video series where I explained how you can write tests for existing code, so maybe that's a good starting point for you. But I'll definitely revisit testing and cover that in more detail in the channel. All right. Imtiaz asks, what's your preferred Python package manager? Thoughts on Poetry? Yeah, I do like Poetry a lot. I think it combines a lot of useful features. It's, in my opinion, it's pretty straightforward to use it. I want to do a separate video on Poetry. I haven't spent a lot of time on packaging on the video in my channel. So yeah, I like Poetry, and I'll revisit it in another video soon. Ogjen asked, have you ever worked with TypeScript? And if yes, do you like it? Yes, I like it very much. And I've worked with it a lot for, I think, at least 5 years now. When I started the channel, I thought about not doing it with Python, but doing it with TypeScript, because I do like the language a lot. So, but I didn't do that. So again, maybe I might start a second channel and do some TypeScript content over there. All right, let's see. I think I still have perhaps a few more questions from the community post that I'd like to go through. So there's a question from Gabriella that states, it would be nice to hear about ways to approach high-level design of a software piece. Do you use any specific methods? Do you begin with use cases to define requirements? I've trouble finding a way to decide which classes, modules I need beforehand and how they relate to each other. Yeah, there's a few thoughts about that. First, we use kind of a loose way of doing this. I tend to use the excuse, I work at a startup, so I can do basically whatever crappy thing I want. So I'm going to use that card a bit here. But we do follow, let's say, more user story approach of trying to understand what we need to build. So we build user stories to understand the flows of how people would like to use a particular feature. And then we zoom in more and we think about, okay, what technology are we going to need for that, and what is going to be the overall setup of the code. It depends, of course, very much on your type of company. If you're doing projects for clients, then your approach is probably going to be a bit different. At a startup, it's more iterative, where you have a version of the platform and then you do an iteration, you change a few things based on user feedback, and then you release a new version. So I do think the user stories work really well because it's very user driven. It's very much driven by what users want, and that's really important, obviously. Now, that being said, you know, the second part of your question, Gabriela, is that having trouble finding to decide which classes and modules you need beforehand. Well, that's maybe not something you have to decide beforehand, and at least in part you might have a rough idea, but that's exactly the part where you can actually do things iteratively and revise things while you're working on the code. I mean, you might realize while you're writing that, hey, that part of the code is actually pretty complex, maybe I should split that up more and then create a separate file so that it's a bit more structured. So that's also something that changes while you write the code, so you don't have to predefine everything in your design phase. Also to avoid like the waterfall design problems where you're being too rigid and not being able to change things after you've thought about the design. All right. Another question by F. Jenny is two questions actually. What's the next best way to use massive settings for your project, except for the Hydra library? And is there a nice and concise way to template my project? So template your project, I'm not really sure what you mean by that. I'm guessing you are looking for like a standard setup for your project. I'm not sure what's available in Python for that. I do know that in React you have things like Create React App, which sets up like standard boilerplate and setup for your project. So maybe somebody of you knows a cool tool that does that for Python as well. Yeah, and dealing with settings, I must say I did a video about Hydra, and at the time I was pretty enthusiastic about it, but honestly, it's also, I think, introduces a lot of complexity if you're using complex settings like that. So what I tend to do is really focus on trying to minimize settings and trying to decide, hey, are there maybe settings that we really don't need to expose, and keeping things a bit simpler. So instead of thinking about how to have like tens or hundreds of different settings and being able to change all those things, think about is it really needed that we change all those settings? And can we perhaps set it up differently so that it becomes simpler and that we have, let's say, higher level settings that control multiple parameters and that are simpler and then also more intuitive. It's like user interface design in a sense, where you're considering how your user optimally interacts with your application through the user interface, and it takes many iterations to get there. You can think of configuration settings as the way that a developer or perhaps a QA person interacts with your software, and you can certainly also optimize things there. So I would start there and try to optimize that aspect instead of trying to fit all those massive settings in your application. See if you can simplify them. If you can simplify them, try to group them as much as possible so that there is one level where you're accessing all those configuration settings and not all over the place in your code. Otherwise, you're going to lose the overview of where everything is very quickly. Mike also asked, it would be good to talk about some of the downsides of object-oriented programming in your videos and where other approaches such as procedural code with simple data classes might be preferred. Yeah, if you noticed probably in my videos of the last half year or so, I've been using less and less complex classes and moving way more in the direction of procedures, functions, and then have relatively simple data-focused classes, data classes basically. I feel like that helps a lot in simplifying things. If you purely look at, I think object-oriented programming, I mean, it has a few advantages. I mean, classes can group things, can structure things, so that's useful. And you have the whole inheritance mechanism, of course, which is a feature that can be useful sometimes. But Python has also a lot of opportunities to do that in a different way. I mean, it also has modules and folders and different files. So there's no need always to use classes for structuring things. I think classes are really helpful for representing instances of data, and then you have maybe many of those, so that's why it's useful to create actual objects that contain the data. But inheritance is also something that you have to be careful about, right? I talk a lot about in my videos where I cover design principles that you have to be really careful with inheritance hierarchies that are really deep, because inheritance is one of the strongest types of coupling you can have. So often a process or a model where you're using composition works a lot better, because then it's much easier to separate. You can use some dependency injection, dependency inversion even, if with a protocol class or an ABC, and then it's also much easier to split up things. So that's definitely one of the downsides of object-oriented programming, that you have all these inheritance mechanisms at your fingertips, and maybe especially if you're a less experienced person, you think that, oh, that's apparently the way that we need to write programs. And then you start doing that, and then you start to get lost. Well, just keeping things simple actually works perfectly fine. All right. Few more final questions, and then I'm going to sleep, because it's already 10 p.m. here, and I'm old, so I'm not used to sleeping late anymore. And my kids are always awake very early, so I have to watch my sleep hours. So Elker asked, any advice on time management? How do you manage your time? Yeah, that's more like a general question. I mean, I do a lot of different things, actually, which makes it a bit hard, like, running a YouTube channel, and I still do some coding sometimes, and then I also run a company, and I also have a family at home. So I always try to think of what I do in terms of a few different steps. So one of the first things that I always ask myself is it really necessary to do this particular thing? So sometimes you can just manage your time by not doing certain things. because they're just not important in the end. So it's really about prioritizing. That really helps. Another thing that I also try to do is automate things. I mean, I love writing scripts for lots of different things. So I think a lot about, okay, the task that I'm doing, can I write a script to make that easier, or make it, help me do the repetitive things automatically? So when I'm like evaluating tools, I use like lots and lots of tools around my YouTube channel, like for posting things on social media, and of course video editing, and the whole online course platform and everything associated with that. So I typically really focus on picking tools that help me automate things. And if I can't not do something, so I have to do it, and I also can't automate it, well, then maybe I can delegate it. Can I hire somebody to do that job? It's something that I think a lot about. And well, until recently, I've been doing a lot of the work in ArjanCodes alone, although I do work with a really awesome video editor since almost a year now. And that has been such a pleasure. Since, yesterday, a new team member started as part of ArjanCodes. So that's also really helpful in distributing some of the work, and that I don't have to do all of those things alone anymore. You can't imagine what goes on behind the scenes of running a YouTube channel. It's what you see basically is a video once a week, but there's like lots of crazy stuff that's happening in the back end. And it's actually really interesting to see how that all works. And I also plan to, share from time to time some of the things that are happening behind the scenes, and give you some ideas of what goes on when you run a YouTube channel like this. All right, I'm going on to the last question. So that's a question by, Camilo. Do you have a good way of injecting dependencies to an AWS Lambda handler in Python for testing? In JavaScript is easy with a higher order function, and in Python you're stuck with monkey patching. I haven't used AWS Lambda handler specifically. I would approach it a bit differently. I would put the code that is run inside your handler function. That's in the end the code that you need to test. I would split that out in a separate operation layer. And in that operation layer, you have your own function. And then you can basically call it any way you want, and you can write a test for that. So I wouldn't use the handler function from AWS in your tests at all. I would just simply let that call the actual function that does the actual job, and then write the test for that. All right, so I'm going to close off for tonight. It was really great to chat with you. Thank you for all your questions. I really like hearing from you and hearing what you're thinking about, and hopefully also provide some helpful advice to you. So before I leave, I'm just going to do a little spam promotion. So I have my software designer mindset course, because I added like a bunch of new materials to the course, like new lessons, extra quizzes, exercises, lots of extra stuff. The price is going to increase after the end of this week. So if you still want to get into the course at the current price, which is a great value, you still can do that until this Friday at midnight. And I offer a 100% money back guarantee, because I want to make sure that if you buy the course that you're actually getting a result out of it. And if you don't get a result, I shouldn't get your money, so you get a full refund from me. So arjan.code/mindset if you want to read more about my course. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you have a great night, and I'll be back on Friday with a new video. Bye bye.